We are up to the next chapter, which is Perek Gimel, and the unit of the next chapter, which is the crossing of the Yarden, really covers. Let's take care of that. The unit chapter 3 and 4 is really covers two chapters, 3 and 4. It's one story. Not quite sure. I understand a little bit of why it's divided into two chapters, but nonetheless, so we're gonna do a piece at a time. But sometimes it's important to get the whole picture. So we'll read it through as much as we can, time permitting, and then we'll kind of analyze in more in depth. וישכם יהושע בבוקר וייסעו מהשיטים ויבואו עד הירדן הוא וכל בני ישראל וילינו שם טרם יעבורו. So if you remember, God had said to them, move the camp towards the Yarden. It took them 3 days to get to the edge of the Yarden, from Zayin Adar until the 10th of Zayin Nisan until the 10th of Nisan. That was the story of the spies at the same time. The spies came back, and now Vahimiksei Shloshit Yamim, 3 days hence, Vayavu Hashotrim B'Kerev HaMachana, and now they're instructing the people in terms of what's required for crossing over the Jordan River. Vayitzavu Ta'am Lemor. They instructed the people as follows: Kiratchem et Aron Brit Hashem Elokechem. When you see the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, the Ark with the tablets, and the Kohanim, who are called Kohanim Leviim, they're called the Kohanim Leviim. That's a phrase from Sefer, but essentially the Kohanim, Nos Imoto, carrying it. That's your sign to get up and start to travel, to follow it. However, keep your distance. Keep your distance between you and the ark, approximately 2,000 cubits, which more or less is the size of the camp of Israel. You have to sort of keep a very significant difference between you and the ark. Al tikrevu elav, leman asher tidu et haderech asher tilchu ba, ki lo avartem baderech mitmo shilshom. So that you'll know which way to go. If the ark is just in front of the front rank of people as they're traveling, and your camp is 2 miles long, then people in the back aren't going to be able to see the ark. But if the ark travels far enough in front so that the people in the back can see, and remember that where the ark went, so did the cloud, the Ananei Kavod. And so if it's far enough in front, then the people in the back can still see it. And that's how the ark would guide where they would go. That's part one. Part two, before it was the Shotrim who spoke to the people, now it's Yehoshua. And he says to them, Hitgadashu, sanctify yourself, prepare yourselves. Ki macha yaseh Hashem b'kibachem niflaot. Tomorrow, God will do wonders. Then he turned to the Kohanim. So it's a bunch of instructions. The Shotrim to the people, Yehoshua to the people, then Yehoshua to the Kohanim. Lots of instructions. Now we're moving. It's about to happen. Take the ark, pass before the people. So they did, right? Tell them what they're going to do. Tell them that they tell us that they did it, and tell us what they did. Right? So sort of the paraphrase. Now God speaks to Yehoshua. Lots of dialogue. This day I will magnify you before the eyes of all of Israel, so that all will know that as I was with Moshe, I will be with you. It's an additional instruction God gives to Yehoshua to instruct the Kohanim. When you get to the edge of the Yarden, stop. Vayomer Yehoshua b'nei Yisrael, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Yarden, Yarden tamodu, in the Yarden you will stand, you will stop. Vayomer Yehoshua b'nei Yisrael, goshu hena v'shimu et divrei Hashem Elokecha. Approach, come, I will tell you what God said. Vayomer Yehoshua b'zot ted'un ki el chai b'kirbechem, with this you will know that the living God is amongst you. He will drive out all the nations of Canaan before you. Behold, the ark of covenant, master of the earth. It's going in front of you into the Yarden. Take 12 men, a leader, one from each tribe. The moment the soles of the feet of the Kohanim were carrying the ark touched the waters of the Yarden, the waters of the Jordan will be cut off. All the waters that are coming down from above, they will stand up like one wall, like one heap. And that's how it came to pass. As the people of Kohanim, the people traveled from the tents to the Yarden, the Kohanim carrying the Aron went before the people. The moment the feet of the Kohanim touched the water, and the Yarden was overflowing its banks all through the harvest. All the water that came from above, from the Kinneret, flows down towards the Yam HaMelech. All the water in the Yarden stood in one heap, one wall. Far away, all the way up at Adam Ha'ir. And the waters that were going down to the Yam HaMelech, they got cut off. And the people could cross the dry land opposite Yericho. The priests that bore the ark stood on the firm ground inside the Yarden. And then they were standing on dry land, on dry ground, until the entire nation passed over the Yarden. This is what we refer to as, in Hebrew, Chatzayat Yarden, in English, the splitting of the Yarden, which isn't really splitting because they didn't split the Yarden, rather he dammed up the Yarden at one side and let the waters flow. One of the major differences between the story of Kriyat Yamsuf and the Yarden was that the Yamsuf split in apart, and the waters were like a wall on either side, whereas here they walked in between, and they walked in between, whereas here, Ned Echad, it was one heap, one pillar of water, and then it didn't continue to flow. Why that's the case, we'll talk about as we progress through this story. That's part one. So the waters split, or the waters dried up, and they crossed over. I want to get through the story so that we have all of this, because there's pieces that we need that are, for our discussion, that are scattered throughout the text. So I want to just run through the rest of the story as well. So we're going to jump into Perek Dalet. When all of Israel passed over the Yarden, remember those 12 men that they had pre-designated? Take 12 stones from the Jordan River, take them from the place where the Kohanim stood. And there You will take them temporarily to the place where you're going to be lodging this night, and then from there you will take them and they will have a home. We will learn what that home is a little bit later. The rest of this has to do with the stones. We'll deal with the stones, B'ezrat Hashem, in 2 weeks' time. Let me just jump to the end of the story. Pasuk Yud. והכהנים נושאי הארון עומדים בתוך הירדן עד תום כל הדבר שציווה השם את יהושע לדבר על העם ככל אשר ציווה משה את יהושע וימהרו העם ויבואו. The Kohanim were still in the waters. The Kohanim and the ark stood in the water in order to prevent the waters from returning as all of Israel crossed over. The moment the people all crossed to the other side, the ark and the priests passed before the people, and Vayavru b'nei Reuven u'bnei Gad v'chatzi shevet HaMenashe chamushim lifnei b'nei Yisrael. Reuven, Gad, half of Menashe that were going to be on the other side of the Yarden, they went chamushim, armed, before b'nei Yisrael as the front line, as the forward soldiers, forward lines, chamushim, armed, kasher diber alehem Moshe. There were about 40,000 Karvim Elev Chalutze Hatzava, 40,000 armed ready for war. Avu lifnei Hashem l'machama el arvot Yericho. Vayom hu gidal Hashem et Yehoshua b'nei kol Yisrael vayiru oto kasher yiru Moshe et Moshe kol yemei chayav. That day, Yehoshua's status in the eyes of the people expanded, grew to the point where they feared him as they feared Moshe. And there's instructions back to the Kohanim to return back to the dry land. I'm going to skip that for now. And I'm going to just the last couple of psukim. We'll reread this all next class. I just want to get to the last couple of sentences because they're relevant to our discussion today. V'odatem et b'nechem lemor beyabasha avay Yisrael et hayarden hazeh. You will tell your children that Israel crossed over the Jordan on dry land. God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you so that you could pass over. The parallel to Yamsuf is not an accident, it's intentional, just as God did to the Yamsuf. So the peoples of the earth will know the hand of God, that it is mighty, and that you may fear God forever. Okay. I tried to gloss over the whole story of the stones, because that's a separate piece, which we'll talk about, and just deal with the story of the crossing of the Yarden. So let's go back to chapter 3 for a moment. There's a lot to unpack here, and we're not going to get to all of it. We're going to take specific pieces that I want to try to address. But the first is, and for us, the important piece at the beginning, is the role of the ark. There's a lot of emphasis on the role of the ark. From the very first command, Yehoshua says to the Shotrim, the Shotrim tell the people, when you see the Kohanim carrying the ark, you will know it's time to go and you will follow them, but keep your distance from the ark. Yehoshua tells the people, prepare yourselves for 3 days. When you see the ark, know that that's the moving, you know that's the time to move. The ark began to move and they followed. So a lot of emphasis on the fact that the ark went before the people and that the ark was carried by the Kohanim. And that's somewhat of a mystery. Why? Because it identifies essentially 2 anomalies. There are 2 things out of the ordinary with regards to this ark as it carries through, as it is carried by the Kohanim before the people. The first has to do with its location. Where did the ark typically travel? Right? The ark is a movable object. They carried it through the desert for 40 years. When they carried it through the desert, where did they typically carry the ark? And the answer to that question is, I would have to reread all sections of Sefer Shmot and Bamidbar, but more or less, when the camp of Israel traveled, they always traveled in formation. They always traveled in the structure of the Galim, the banners that were set out in the beginning of the book of Bamidbar. And so you had groups of tribes. You had the Degel of Yehuda, you had the Degel of Reuven, you had the Degel of Ephraim, you had the Degel of Dan, you had the banners of the four main groups, and each banner contained three tribes, right? Like a box. That's how they camped. And when they traveled in formation, meaning the Degel of Yehuda went first, and the banner of Reuven went second, and then the Ark and the Mishkan and the Kalim went in the middle. Then you had the camp of Ephraim, and then you had the camp of Dan. And that was the structure, that was the sequence by which they traveled for 40 years. There's several anomalies in this story. The first is that the ark is not in the middle of the camp. The ark has been moved to the front of the camp. There's another anomaly, and that is, let's see if I can find it. Where that reference is. At the end of chapter 4, the ark went before the people. ויעברו בני ראובן ובני גד וחצי שבט המנשה כ40,000 חלוצי צבא. The tribe of Reuven went next, and then the rest of the people went behind, which is also somewhat of an anomaly, that Reuven would go first. The Degel of Reuven was, in fact, throughout the 40 years in the desert, the banner that went second. The banner of Yehuda went first, Reuven went second. And yet here Reuven goes in front of the camp and not behind. They are referred to as the Chalutzei Tzava, the ready for armed, or the Chalutzim, the front lines. You see it again in the story of Yericho, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks. But just to give you a quick glance at it, when they surround Yericho in a very similar fashion, the Kohanim carrying the ark and blowing the shofar, surrounding the Kohanim, the ark was walking in the front of the people, and the Kohanim were carrying it, and the Kohanim were blowing the shofar, and they did 7 circuits of whole Hakafot that came, a story of Hakafot that comes from there. But what's interesting there is it says, Vayikra Yehoshua ben Nun el HaKohanim v'yom alehem su'ut aron habrit. The Kohanim take the Aron. V'shiva Kohanim yisu shiva shofot yovlim, and you have 7 priests in front of them carrying the ark. Vayhi ka'emo Yehoshua ta'am על העם ושבעה כהנים נושאי 7 שופרות היובלים לפני השם עברו ותקעו בשופרות. I skipped the pasuk here. ויאמר על העם עברו וסובו את העיר, go and pass surround the city, והחלוץ יעבור לפני ארון השם. And the chalutzim, right, which we translate as the armed body here, but the first ranks of the army, they will travel in front of the ark. So the only difference is that by the Yarden, they were behind the ark, and in Yericho, they're in front of the ark. But who are the chalutzim? Who are this group of the chalutz Ya'avor Lifnei Aron Hashem? They're the tribe of Reuven, and they're constantly referred to as the chalutz throughout Sefer Yehoshua. והחלוץ הולך לפני הכהנים תוקעי שופרות, והמאסף הולך אחרי Aaron, and the rest of the rear guard went behind, but the chalutz, the armed ones, meaning Reuven and his banner, they went first. So, in summary of it, if you take a look at this chart, what I wanted to point out is that there's a really interesting shift going on. In the Midbar for 40 years, Yehuda they traveled as they camped. Yehuda, the banner of Yehuda first, banner of Reuben second, the Aron in the middle, Ephraim and Dan at the back. When they cross the Yarden, two things change. Number one, the Aron goes first at a distance of 2,000 Amma. Number one. Number two, Reuven is moved, it's called the Chalutz, and moved to the front line of the camp, in front of Yehuda. And when they get to Yericho, and there's a battle around Yericho, and they have to surround the city and do the circuits, Reuven goes first. Then the Tokei Shafot, then the Aron, and then Yehuda, Ephraim, and Dan. So we'll deal with the Yericho a little bit more in detail at a later stage, but there seems to be something going on because it's significant enough for the text to highlight where the Aron was and where Reuven was in this story. Now, it's interesting to note, and the Reuven piece of it, I'll share with you one observation, and then we'll come back to it. Even this formation is somewhat of an anomaly. Why do I say that? If you look in Perek Aleph of Bamidbar, let me just pull that up. I hadn't prepared that one. If you look in Perek Aleph of Bamidbar, where the census is taking place, the census starts with the tribe of Reuven. And the sequence of the tribes as they're listed in Bamidbar chapter 1 is the same sequence of the Degalim, it's the same sequence of the banners. But it starts with Reuven, then Shimon, and then Gad. Then it goes to Yehuda and Yisachar and Zebulun, etc., etc. So Reuven is first. When you read chapter 2, and these groups of tribes are put together into banners, Ishal Diglo, then the first listing of the first banner is Yehuda. And Reuven is now second. And there's a discussion as to why that is the case, but for the rest of the 40 years, they will travel in accordance with the sequence of chapter 2, Yehuda first. And only as they enter the land of Israel, suddenly Reuven goes back to being first.
Wasn't he committed to go first? And they said there'll be chalutzim when they went, right. When they got
so that's exactly the point.
On the other side of the Jordan.
Correct. So that's exactly the point that I wanted to make, that this anomaly, this change of the role of Reuven is part of the commitment that Reuven made, Reuven and Gad and Shimon, Reuven, Gad and Menashe, made to Moshe, that they would in fact take on that new role as chalutzim before Bnei Israel. So that commitment wasn't just that they would cross the Yarden with Israel and they would fight with the battles of Israel until the people of Israel settled their land and then they would go back. That's how it's perceived in Bamidbar and Chumash, that they agreed to cross over and fight the wars with Israel. But in fact, the way it turns out is that not only did they fight the wars with the rest of Israel, but they did so as the chalutzim, they did so as the front line, which is always the most dangerous group of chayalim to put, right? Your front lines are almost always the most vulnerable, especially when you fight in rank and file. So the agreement, the willingness of Reuven, not just to cross over, but in fact their entire banner gets moved to the front line, to the front of the line, and Yehuda behind him, tells me something about the significance of that commitment. It wasn't just an agreement to fight and to cross over the Yarden with Israel, but in fact to become the chalutzim, the front lines, and that's how they remain until the end of Sefer Yehoshua. So that's just a fascinating observation about Reuven and Gad. The other difference is that their formation, and this we will unpack in much greater detail later in the book, but I want to put it out there now. The galim, the banners, more or less parallel the structure of how the camp was laid out in their settlement of the land of Israel. Which tribes went where, more or less parallels how they marched through the Midbar. There's some changes we'll talk about. But what's interesting there is that when they originally were planning to come to the land of Israel, the original route had them entering Israel from the south. Before the Meraglim, right? They were entering from Kadesh. They were entering from the south. If they were entering from the south, they were entering the tribal territory of Yehuda and the Negev and Hebron. And therefore it made sense for Yehuda to be first in line. Whereas now they're entering from the east, and they're entering from the tribal territory of Reuven. And so that sequence, that structure changes, and now it's Reuven who's leading the march of the tribes. So that's one observation. The much more significant observation, however, is the role of the Aron. The Aron takes on an extraordinary piece here, because two things change. Number one, the Aron never traveled in the front of the camp. The Aron always traveled in the middle of the camp. And number two, the Kohanim didn't carry the Aron when the Aron marched. Who carried the Aron when it marched, when they marched with it through the desert? The
Leviim.
Correct. Right? They had to carry it covered so nobody could, right, in a special way. So this already the Gemara points out. It's a Gemara in Sota, and I put here, there's two Gemaras in Sota. We're going to look at the first. Tanu Rabbanan, Ketzad Davu Yisrael at Yarden. How did the Israel cross the Yarden? B'chol yom Aron noseach hashnei dgalim. V'hayom nesat tchila. Every other day, meaning for 40 years, they've been traveling through the desert. The ark traveled between the banners of Yehuda, Reuven in front, and Ephraim and Dan in the back. But here, in this instance, the Aaron went first. Shenema hine Aaron abrit adon kol haaretz ove lifnechem. That's one anomaly. The other anomaly, and I think they're connected, b'chol yom v'yom Leviim nosim et Aaron. Every other day, the Levites, the Leviim, would carry the ark. V'yayom nisa'u kohanim. But today the kohanim carried it. As it says, v'yakinuach kapot raglei kohanim noseh Aaron Hashem. And in fact, the Gemara goes on to suggest that there are three roles in which the Kohanim carried the ark publicly. Number one, Kishavuot HaYarden, when they crossed the Jordan. When they will surround Yericho, I showed you those verses as well. And Kishechziru Limkomo, when they took the ark from the Leviim to put it back in the Kodesh HaKodashim, when they reset up the Mishkan, that the Kohanim had to do, because they had to go into the Kodesh HaKodashim to put it in its place. The Leviim could not do that. So those three instances, the ark was carried by the Kohanim, and in this case, it went before the people. So what's the significance of both of these anomalies? One, that it's carried by the Kohanim, and B, that it went significantly in front of the people, Ke'alpayim Amma. And it's hard to say for sure, but I wonder if we can pick up on another nuance. I'm going to come back, hold that question. I'm just going to park it for a second. But there's another series of nuanced parallels that I want to try to identify. For example, Perek Gimel Pasuk Dalet.
Exactly.
You have to keep your distance from the ark, 2,000 cubits. Al tikrevu elav, don't approach it. It will guide you in your way. Sanctify yourselves. Because tomorrow you're going to see wonders. Keeping your distance from the ark, prepare yourself. We had 3 days earlier, the Aron in front of the people instead of in the midst of the people, carried by the Kohanim. Does anybody sense a pattern of what these hints are reflecting or connecting us to? I think that certainly the 3 days and the distance from the ark, which represents the Shekhinah, and the preparation they have to go through Yitkadashu, all are signs, all are references that take us back to where?
Ma'amad Har Sinai.
Ma'amad Har Sinai. It takes us back into the world of that moment of the revelation of God at Sinai, where they had 3 days of preparation, where they were not allowed to approach the mountain, where they had to keep the distance from the mountain. Pull the psukim here for a moment, starting with pasuk tet. V'yomer Hashem Moshe, Hinei anochi ba elecha ba'av ha'anan. I'm going to come to you in the thickness of the cloud. We'll talk about the cloud in a moment. B'avu yishma ha'am b'dabi imach v'gam b'chai aminu le'olam. And they should hear my speech to you, and they will trust in you for always. Moshe tells the people, "Vayomer Hashem Moshe lecha la'am v'kidashtam hayom u'machar v'chipsu simlotam." Let them sanctify themselves today, tomorrow, v'ayu nechonim layom hashlishi, so that they can be prepared for the third day. Because on the third day, the people, the God will come down and be seen in front of all the people. But the people have to set a boundary, a border. They can't go up the mountain. They can't touch the mountain. They have to keep their distance. So you have to keep your distance. There's a 3-day preparation. They're going to see a manifestation of the Shekhinah. That's exactly what's going on here. You have exactly the same process. Prepare them for 3 days, tell them to sanctify themselves, get themselves ready. They're going to see something of a manifestation. And what does that manifestation reflect? The Aron, the ark, comes, not only the splitting of the sea, but the ark goes in front of the people, carried by the Kohanim. The ark goes in front of the people, carried by the Kohanim. Right. Here's something the text doesn't tell me. I have no way of knowing it, but it's a guess. But I think it makes sense. When the Neviim carried the ark in the midst of the camp, was the ark covered or uncovered?
Covered. Didn't they say? Yeah, they had to like orotachash and whatever. They had to cover it.
Always covered. When the Kohanim took the Aron into the waters of the Yarden, 2,000 cubits in front of the camp of Israel, and the cloud that hovered over the ark now went and hovered over the ark in 2,000 amot in front of them, so that the cloud of the Shekhinah could split the waters as they entered. Was the ark covered or uncovered? Doesn't tell us, but I would bet that it was uncovered. Because the whole notion here is that it was a manifestation of God's presence. They were feeling and seeing the Shekhinah. They were, in fact, almost like a parallel to the story of Ma'amad HaSinai. They were experiencing the presence of God as he brought them into the land of Israel. The fact that the Kohanim are carrying the Aron means that the Kohanim carried the Aron uncovered. And they walked in front of the people so that not only Israel, but all of the nations of the world would watch and see and perceive the story of the crossing of the Yarden, could see the ark. And when they took the ark into battle, in the Sefer Shmuel, beginning of Shmuel, there's a story where they take the ark into battle against the Plishtim. They want the ark, they want the power of the ark to work for them in battle. It's clear that they took the ark uncovered into battle.
But they get punished then, that's what I don't understand, because I was going to bring that up, because they get punished for bringing it, and then, it had to go to Kiryat Yearim, so
it wasn't done by God's command, for sure. But right? But you see that they carried it uncovered because the Plishtim look at the ark and proclaim, these are the gods of Israel, which means seeing the Kruvim. So that was clearly uncovered. So if that was uncovered, this for sure was uncovered. The
Rabbi, what was never stated, covered or not covered, in Shmuel, it was never stated.
I'm just saying. So I'm telling you that what it does say is that the Plishtim looked at the ark, and they said, "These are the gods of Israel who fought with them in Egypt." The plural there is understood by all the Mefarshim as a reference to the Kruvim, which means that they saw the Kruvim. That means that the ark had to be uncovered. We can argue about it, but that's not the point. I use it as an example, but it's clear that the Plishtim saw the Kruvim at that moment, and they said they pointed to the Kruvim and they said, "These are the gods of Israel," in their idolatrous pagan mindset.
But wasn't that they say like a model that, like God is going to go and fight for them, go in front, and that's why they brought it? So why would they get punished?
I'm not getting to Shmuel. Shmuel will take us complicated. It'll take us into a whole different arena. I'm happy to discuss Shmuel offline. I use it as an example because I think it's a powerful moment of the Aron representing the Shekhinah, representing God's presence here, and that's exactly what's going on. Right? It's not just that the Kohanim are going to step in the water, and because they've got the ark with them, the sort of this magic power of the ark, and it's going to split the waters. Right? There's a much bigger issue here, which is there's a manifestation that people are going to see. God is going to do wonders for you. You're going to see the Shekhinah. So for that, the ark had to function not as a part of the Mishkan, Neviim carrying the ark covered like the rest of the Mishkan, but as a kli, as a vessel, as a utensil, as the Shekhinah, as the Merkavah, as the throne of God. Remember that the ark with the covenant, with the tablets, with the kruvim, in its entirety, represented the Merkavah, represented the throne of God. So it's the manifestation, the image here is that Ki'ilu, Kaviyachol, their king walks before them. The Kohanim carrying the ark means that the king is leading them into the waters and across the Yarden. King of kings. But for that, the ark has to be open, and there has to be this manifestation of the Shekhinah. And I'll show you one additional observation. The parallel to Ma'amad Sinai is striking, and in fact, it's expressed directly at the end, right? The parallel to Kriyas Yamsuf, but the parallel to Ma'amad Sinai here is extraordinary. And we come to Pasuk Zion, and one additional parallel, which I think is the key to this whole story. Vayomer Hashem al Yehoshua, Hayom hazeh achel gadelcha be'enei kol Yisrael. On this day, I will magnify you in the eyes of Israel. I will make you. This isn't just to cross over the Yarden for the sake of the people of Israel practically, and the Canaanites theologically. They should see God's power. Right? This was also for Yehoshua. The people need to see you and know that I will be with you. As I was with Moshe, I will be with you. And for that, we need to repeat what Moshe was able to accomplish. Moshe was able to accomplish Ma'amad Sinai and Kriyat Yamsuf. You need to start your journey with an equivalent moment of Kriyat Yamsuf, but also Ma'amad Sinai. It's not enough, and we'll see the connections between Yericho there as well. And that's exactly what happened at Ma'amad Sinai. God said to did I close it? Did I close it? No, here it is. When Moshe is told that God is going to speak to him in the presence of all of Israel, Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Hinei Anochi ba elecha ba'av ha'anan, ba'avur yishma ha'am b'dabri imach v'gam b'cha ya'aminu li'olam. One of the primary purposes of Ma'amad Sinai wasn't just to convey the Torah, to convey manifestations, that they should have the power of prophecy, they should understand it, but that it should empower Moshe so that people would understand and trust Moshe for all eternity. That was the key message, that he should become the chief of all Neviim. And that exact same message appears here. We need Yehoshua to enter into that role so that the people will see Yehoshua as no less powerful, if not maybe even almost as powerful as Moshe himself. And that, I think, is one of the key messages to this story. While I'm here, let me pull one additional observation, really from the next unit, but it's relevant here, right? To see the splitting of the Yarden and the role of Yehoshua in that moment as the disciple of Moshe, and to earn the trust of Moshe, of the people. As they trusted Moshe, they will now trust Yehoshua. To see the role of Kriyat Chatziyat Yarden, right, the crossing of the Yarden, in the same role as Ma'amad Sinai, and the handing over of the role of leadership from Moshe to Yehoshua in that process has one additional parallel. It's not referred to in the text here because it hasn't happened yet. But we have the benefit of hindsight, and so I want to take you into a story in Malachim Bet. The only other time in history in Tanakh where the waters of the Jordan River were split. And that is, anybody know? Elisha. Eliyahu and Elisha. The story is Malachim Bet Perek Bet. Vahi ba'alot Hashem et Eliyahu b'sara shamayim. As God was about to bring Eliyahu up to heaven in a whirlwind, you all know, right? Eliyahu goes up to Shamayim. Unclear what that means. Eliyahu and Elisha now start a journey. And part of that journey is to hand the mantle of leadership over from Eliyahu to Elisha. V'yomer Eliyahu Elisha shev na po ki Hashem shlachani ad Beit El, v'yomer Elisha chai Hashem v'chei nafshecha mezveka v'yadu ad Beit El. They go together. There's a journey from Gilgal to Beit El. Why these places? Well, we're not going to get into too much now. It's complicated for us, but he comes to Beit El and they have the same dialogue. Stay here, and he says, "I'm going down to Yericho." V'yomer lo Eliyahu, Elisha shev na po ki Hashem shlachani Yericho. Say here, God has sent me over to Yericho. V'yomer chai Hashem v'chei nafshecha mezveka v'yavo Yericho. I'm not leaving you. They go to Yericho. The Bnei Neviim, the students of the schools of prophets, came over to Elisha and Yericho, and they said to him, "Ayadata ki hayom Hashem lokechet adonecha me'avoshecha." Do you know that God is going to take your master away from you today? He says, "I know." Shh, be still. Hechesh. Again, Eliyahu says to him, "Stay here. God has sent me to the Yarden." Vayomer lo Eliyahu, shev na po ki Hashem shlachani hayardena. More or less, can you see the pattern from Gilgal to Beit El? Is complicated. We'll leave Beit El out of the picture, but from Gilgal to Yericho to the Yarden. You see the reverse of the process of the journey of Israel. They go together. And there's this bunch of schools of Neviim, and they stood on at a distance. Eliyahu and Elisha stood by the Yarden. Vayikach Eliyahu et adarto vayiglom. He took his mantle, whatever his mantle was, his cloak, wrapped it together, vayaker tamayim, and he smote the water. It's a combination of a bunch of stories of Chumash, kind of images coming together. Smote the water, and the waters split here and there. And the two of them walked across the Yarden on dry ground. Anybody ever, right? It's an observation. We're talking about the Yarden, but it's split like the Yam Suf. It's split apart rather than the way the Yarden is. Now they're both on the other side of the Yarden. And Eliyahu says to Elisha, ask of me, and I will, before I am taken from you. What do you want? Elisha, now, that's a very famous verse. We read this as a Haftarah. It's a very famous verse. It's translated as, let me have double the portion of spirit, of nevuah, of power that you had, which is understood by the Mefarshim as the height of chutzpah. I mean, Pishnayim. I once heard from Rav Yoel Ben Nun, fascinating shir on the word pim, that appears only once in Chumash in Sefer Shmuel. Pim was a coin that was essentially equal to half a shekel. They found an archaeological coin with the word pim on it. And his theory is Pishnayim means not double, but half.
Like the coin.
Like the coin. So there's it's a theory out there. I like it because it actually makes sense. What he's asking for is at least I should have half of what you have, which makes more sense in the context. Vayomer says, Eliyahu, you've asked a very difficult thing. I can't promise, but if you see what I am taking up to Shemaim, if you are able to see it, then you know that God has granted your wish. There's a chariot of fire, pillar of fire, horses of fire. Separating them, and Eliyahu goes up to Shemaim. My father, chariot of Israel and its horsemen. And he didn't see Eliyahu anymore. He tore his clothes in two pieces. Now watch what happens in Pasuk Gimel and Yadalid. Vayarem et aderet Eliyahu. He picks up the mantle of Eliyahu, asher nafla me'elav, which fell. Vayashav vayamod al svat Yarden. And he goes back and he stands on the banks of the Jordan. Vayikach et aderet Eliyahu asher nafla me'elav vayakeh et hamayim. He takes the aderet and he smites the water. And he says, Ayeh Hashem Elokei Eliyahu. Where is the God of Eliyahu? Afu vayakeh et hamayim. So when he smote the waters, vayachatzu eina ve'eina v'yavo Elisha. Waters divided here and there, and Elisha crossed back over. Vayir'u b'nei Neviim asher b'yericho mineged. When the b'nei Neviim saw on the other side of the Yarden, Vayomu, they said, Nacha ruach Eliyahu el Elisha. Elisha has walked into the footsteps of Eliyahu, and they were now able to see Elisha in the light of as the disciple and the continuity of the Navi of the Nevuah of Eliyahu. The notion of using the crossing of the Yarden and the splitting of the Yarden, and as a mechanism, as a means to transfer the leadership from Eliyahu to Elisha and the trust of the people to Elisha as they had with Eliyahu, is precisely the story that we're reading here. Right? That's exactly what was happening here at the Yarden. Moshe was known for major miracles, Kriyat Yamsuf, Mamar Sinai, Kriyat Yamsuf. Yehoshua steps into that role. So the first thing that has to happen is people have to see Yehoshua in exactly the same context. That's what Hashem says to Yehoshua. That today, Achel Gadelcha Be'inei Kol Yisrael. This story of splitting the sea, of splitting the Yarden, will enable you to have that role amongst the people. The people will see a very interesting phrase that appears in Pasuk Yud Vayomer Yehoshua Bezot Tedun Ki Kel Chai Bekirbecha. This story of the splitting of the Yarden, you will see that God is a living God amongst you, meaning that it's a dynamic relationship. Moshe, God, Israel, Yehoshua, God. It's a dynamic triangle. But that Yehoshua steps into exactly that role. And the notion that Eliyahu and Elisha used that same story for the same purpose, I think emphasizes or strengthens this parallel, both to Mamar Sinai and to the notion of the transfer of the leadership from Yehoshua from Moshe to Yehoshua. Okay,
I have a
that's part one. Yeah, question.
The question. I see that there is a major difference, though, between how Yehoshua crosses the Jordan and Moshe and Eliyahu, because Moshe uses the staff. Eliyahu uses the aderet, which also has a meaning, and then Elisha uses the aderet. Here, it says not even that Yehoshua, it's the feet of the Kohanim. When the feet of the Kohanim go into the Jordan, that's when when the water stops. So it's not an active movement of Yehoshua. He's not an action of Yehoshua. There is a problem there.
I will. So my answer to you is that it has nothing to do with the Kohanim.
But that's what it says in the text.
That's not what it says. What it says is that it's the Aron. The Kohanim are carrying the Aron.
Beseder.
Aron Abrit. So the regular Kohanim is just a symbol, but they're talking about the Aron. That's why the Aron went in front. That's why the Aron is so central to the story. But Yehoshua is certainly the leader. Yehoshua is instructing. Yehoshua is guiding. Yehoshua is telling them. The fact that Yehoshua doesn't have a staff, no big deal. I was never comfortable with Moshe's staff in the first place, right? Yehoshua doesn't have a staff. He has instructions. He's in many ways the trust that Yehoshua earns from the people is greater than that of Moshe. But at this point, for now, it's sufficient to know that it's the Aron. He'll use the Aron again in Yericho and the shofar. But it's more the experience. The people see the splitting of the Jordan, and they know the story of the splitting of the Yam Suf, right? The notion that becomes a symbol for the trust of Yehoshua, I think is very powerful, and that the Aron plays that role here is even more powerful because the Aron is the Merkava. Just like Eliyahu goes up to Shemayim in the Merkava of the chariots and horses, the Aron is the Merkava. It is the throne of God. Okay, that's part one that I want of the story that I wanted to address, which is the role of the ark in the parallel to Mammon HaSinai, and in so as a byproduct, the centrality of the trust in Yehoshua in this moment. The other part of this story that I want to begin to look at, we're going to just introduce and elaborate on in our next class, which, to remind everybody, is not next week because I am traveling. I will be in Israel next week, so there's no class. B'ezrat Hashem, will reconvene in, I hope, 2 weeks' time. But the other piece that's very important for us is to understand why, not for Yehoshua's purpose, but why it was necessary to cross the Yarden in such a fashion as this, to split the Yarden or to stop it for a pillar. Right? Why was this miracle even necessary? I don't know about you, but anybody ever been to the Jordan River? It's a creek. It's a tiny little creek. And especially in they're in Nisan, they're in springtime, so maybe it's a little bit more. But the notion that it's overflowing its banks, the Yarden is to take the entire people of 600,000 plus men and women, right, the whole army of Israel, and cross the Yarden, needing this kind of supernatural breach of nature miracle. I have to ask yourself why. And the truth is that I didn't ask the question why. The Navi asked the question why. And how do I know the Navi asked the question why? Because anytime you have a question of why, what's the response going to be? Because. Right? If a child asks why, what's the typical answer? Because. So in this case, there's a because. But there are not one because, there's at least 5. Meaning, if you go through the text, you will find that the word lema'an, this is because, this is for the purpose of, this is so that you shall know, this is so that you shall learn. That notion, that emphasis appears scattered throughout the 2 chapters. And what it does is it tells me, there's not one reason for this splitting of the Yarden in this fashion. There are many. So our job is to identify what they are. So we've already identified the first, right? Vayomer Hashem Yehoshua hayom hazeh achel gadelcha be'enei kol Yisrael asher yedaun ki kasher hayiti im Moshe ehyeh imach. The first identified reason for splitting the Yarden in this fashion is for the sake of Yehoshua. So the people will see Yehoshua, know Yehoshua's role as the disciple of Moshe will never be questioned, never be challenged. Despite the ups and downs of the conquest of the wars and the conquest of Israel, they never challenged Yehoshua, which is really fascinating. They challenged Moshe left, right, and center. They never challenged Yehoshua. There's never a question as to his leadership and to the trust in him, and we will explore that as well by in itself. But that is solid. But then we read a little bit further, and we read pasuk Tet and Yud. Vayomer Yehoshua, Yehoshua says to the people, "Bizot tedun ki el chai b'kirbechem." By this you shall know that there is a living God amongst you. V'oresh yorish mipnechem et haknani v'et hachiti v'et hayechivi v'hayeprizi v'hayegashi v'hayemori v'hayebusi. The people should know that God is with them as they begin to enter the land of Israel and the land of Canaan. As the war with the Canaanites begin, know that God is with you. So that's a different reason. It's not just for Yehoshua's sake, but that they should know that God is with the people. So now I've created a little bit of a new nuance. But even that's not enough. Then he talks about the Aron and the Kohanim, and we're going to jump to Perek Daled for a moment. And we have a whole story of the stones, which we'll talk about, and the 12 stones from the bed of the Arden. We're going to talk about that as a separate shir. And then we get to the end of Perek Daled, and we read the following. Vayomer b'nei Yisrael lemor. Asher, tell me what you think this reminds you of. Asher yishalun b'nechem machar et avotam lemor. So if your children tomorrow will ask you, Ma ha'avanim ha'ela, what are these stones?
Haggadah shel Pesach.
Haggadah shel Pesach. But the Torah is filled with these moments where it says, if your child will ask you, and they're all about Pesach, they're all about Yetziat Mitzrayim, they're all about the mother, right? Ki shalun machar b'nechem machar v'yamor ma avodah azot lachem, etc. Right? The question, when your children will ask, what are these stones? So now suddenly there's a whole new purpose for crossing the Yarden and taking the stones out of the Jordan River bed in order to build this monument with the stones, is so that the people will know that the waters of the Yarden were split. Okay? That's the children for generations to come. Well, we're not finished. So God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you as you passed over it. Like you did to the Yamsuf. In order for all of the Canaanite nations to know that the hand of God is strong. Yad Chazakah. Look at how many references to the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yad Hashem, Yad Chazakah, reference to the strong hand of Hashem, the reference to Yamsuf, right? That this had to recreate that moment of Kriyat Yamsuf so that the nations of Canaan will know and sit there a little bit, right? They'll tremble a little bit because they'll know that God split the waters, and the strong hand, the Yad Chazakah of God that took them out of Egypt, is coming to lead them into the land of Canaan. Right? That's in and of itself significant. And then one more. Not just for the Canaanites, but that you should fear God all your days, so that you should have a sense of Yirat Hashem, which is more or less along the lines of what the goal of Maimonides Sinai was about. So I have at least 5 different rationales. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I have at least in this text identified 5 different explanations as to why it was necessary in the text to split the waters of the Yamsuf, and there's more. There's L'man dat kol amei haaretz, that the nations of Canaan shall know. There's L'man yiratem et Hashem, so that you shall fear God. There's the trust in the leadership of Yehoshua. There is the question of how they needed to physically cross the Yarden. There seems to be a reference in the text to that there is an overflowing of the banks of the Yarden. Was the Yarden bigger in those days than it is today? Right? So we'll talk about that. Right? Clearly it is. It must be, and overflowing its banks. And we'll talk and we'll show evidence to the question as to where the how do we know that the Jordan at that time was much bigger? And then on top of all of this, I have these stones, these 12 stones that have to be pulled out of the Yarden riverbed in order to be placed somewhere, and where that is, and all of that's part of the reason why it was necessary to go through this story. So there are at least 5, maybe 6 different reasons that we have to break down, and that will be our task in our next unit. So
What
today we
about
talked about
bitachon b'Hashem?
so that's L'man Yiratem et Hashem. That's what
No, no, no. Yirah in bitachon, that's not the same. Sorry. Now it has,
in modern philosophy and theology, maybe not. In Tanakh terms, I don't think there's a distinction.
and what about, I think that was really had to be done to show them how easy that will be, the transition.
Maybe
That's the transition.
that might be what is referred to when the text says that. I'll show you that text for a second. Maybe that's what's being referred to in the end of Perek Gimel when it says. With this, you will know that there's a living God amongst you, and He will drive out the Canaan. So God is going with you into the land of Canaan with the Aron and the splitting of the sea. It's kind of a recreation of the moment of Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Okay, thank
Part
you.
of the same, I think.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so we will adjourn for now, and we will pick this up again. There's no class next week. I'm away. But we will pick this up as Rav Hashem for now, let's say 2 weeks' time. If that changes, we'll let you know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, v'nesiat tova.
Can I get back to my question from before?
Yes, sure.
I don't think your answer, I don't know, wasn't like.
What was your
I think
question?
that my question was the difference between the means of separating, or splitting the sea and splitting. It's not only, there are too many differences. Splitting the Jordan for Eliyahu, and not only that, the mantle. The significance of clothing in Torah. And the aderet, and the fact that he took the aderet, and like I would go to Shmuel's Me'il or whatever. 1 minute, and there. And here you don't have splitting. You have one whatever column, and not 2. So I think there are too many differences to say that it's exactly the same. So there has to be a difference, and we have to look at the difference and why.
Okay, so my answer to your question is yes, yes, and yes. There are always differences anytime you draw a parallel. Any parallel in Tanakh will always have different. No 2 stories are identical. The question is whether those differences are related to the central theme or message that you're trying to convey. In other words, a parallel has 2 purposes. Number 1, to draw a connection, and number 2, to draw distinctions. So the parallel that I wanted to draw, I think, is common to all 3, which is you have a master and a disciple, and you have a transfer of leadership at that moment. And the single greatest miracle that occurred at Yetziat Mitzrayim that the people saw, over which it says V'yaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo, is Kriyat Yamsuf. So Kriyat Yamsuf becomes the paradigm, the av tipus for a miracle which is of that magnitude and shows that a disciple has the power of the master. So that's what I wanted to say about Yehoshua, and I think, and it's in the text. Right? That's a possible. And I think it's true for Eliyahu and Elisha as well. Now, are there differences? For sure. There are differences. First of all, Moshe uses a staff. Yehoshua uses the Aron, and Eliyahu uses the Aderet, which means that none of them are using the same tool.
Right.
All using a different tool, because they're all using a tool that's relevant to their moment, their leadership. Moshe's staff was with which he smote did the Mitzrayim and did all the Makot Mitzrayim. And so that staff has meaning for them, for Bnei Israel, at that moment. For Yehoshua, it's about the Aron and the Mishkan. The Aron and the Mishkan will play a central role in Sefer Yehoshua and in Sefer Shoftim, and the Aron is the manifestation of the Shechina post Mamad HaSinai. The Shechina moves to the Aron. The staff disappears after Mamad HaSinai. You can't use that staff anymore. Moshe uses it once, and he gets into big trouble for it.
Right.
Okay, so that the Shechina moves to the Aron. In Elisha's case, Elisha is neither a melech, right? He's a Navi, and the Aderet was for him that symbol of who he was and what it represented. And so Elisha, for Eliyahu, so I think that using an Aderet there, he doesn't have a staff, he doesn't have the Aron. I think it makes sense for him to use a cloak, which symbolizes his status as a Navi.
That to me connects with Shmuel and the Meil, like that. Okay, but that was very good answer. I'm convinced.
The second piece of it is why Yehoshua splits the Yarden differently than Moshe and Eliyahu.
Right.
That I'm going to try to address in a different in a later shir. Yehoshua, more or less, Chazal see the splitting of the Yarden by Yehoshua as half of Moshe's power, meaning Moshe is the chief of all Neviim. So Yehoshua needs to step into a role where the people see him as Moshe's disciple, but not Moshe's equal.
But not Moshe, yeah.
Right. And so I think that splitting it halfway achieves that goal. Elisha's that message is not necessary, and you have
it's removed, yeah. Okay.
But the other piece of it is that the splitting into one pillar, one nade, right, is in itself significant because of where that pillar is. But for that, you have to wait till the next year.
That's so nice.
Its location is very powerful, right?
Did it say the location? Hold on. It didn't say.
It does.
It says,
it says that the water was, the nade was by Adam Ha'ir, and the people crossed at Yericho. Today there's a bridge called Gesher Adam. It's the same place.
That's where it is? Okay.
Yeah. So why that's significant, that we'll have to explore. That's going to be part of our discussion next.
They're connecting to Yericho. Okay.
Right. So we'll get there.
Okay, Nasiya Tova. Thank you very much for explaining. That was very nice.
No problem at all.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Have a wonderful afternoon or evening or day. And we'll see you all B'ezrat Hashem in a couple of weeks.
Rabbi?
Yes, sir.
Was it unreasonable for the police team to view the Kruvim and the uncovered ark as Israel's God? I don't think that was.
It was not unreasonable. It was within the realm of their frame of reference for pagan idolaters. It was unreasonable for Israel to take the ark into battle uncovered.
Yes, that's true. But we know that through most of our history, Jews viewed God as a corporeal being. I mean, that was one of Maimonides' issues.
We can debate that, but in the context of Tanakh, it's clear that would be idolatrous. The Kruvim had a different role. The Kruvim were the Merkava, the Kruvim were the angels.
But the police team didn't go to yeshiva day school.
Exactly. So that was one of the reasons. One of the mistakes they made was they placed and I suspect, if you ask me, that remember we're talking about the last battle before the Mishkan is destroyed, and I suspect that the people who took the Mishkan, who took the Aron into battle, felt and thought the same way the Plishtim did.
Fair enough.
Which is why they lost, and why they lost the Aron, and why the Mishkan was destroyed. Or it's all symptoms of the same problem, which goes back to the beginning of Sefer Shmuel.
But you could also make the argument that every time they deviate from what God says to do, they lose a battle, like I in that. So it's nothing to do with the theology of it. It's just not following orders properly.
In that case, it's part of a sequence of events from the beginning of the book that are very theological, but we'd have to unpack Sefer Shmuel. So let's get through
Another
Yehoshua and
course.
Shoftim, and then we'll start Shmuel.
Thank you.
No problem. My pleasure. Anybody else? All right. Have a wonderful day, and I will sign off here.